Disclaimer: if you're easily offended by differing political opinions, then you should probably click off this video right now, because it's about to get heated. Last time on Project E. Assassinations, disappearances, kidnappings. There's a spiritual conquest of the Aztecs. Spoiler alert, it was super violent. What will we cover next? Stay tuned in to find out. Hi, I'm Harper Cates, and today we're going to learn about the history of Central America. Before the Hispanics arrived in Central America, they were dominated by the Mayan culture. The Mayans believed in sacrifice and bloodletting, and emperors were given celebrations on special occasions, usually eclipses. They invented a calendar and a rudimentary form of basketball named puck-to-puck. Here's a video of it being played. Then the Spaniards arrived, and that's where it all went south. There was a lot of violence, there was a lot of resistance. Some native people committed suicide, and many of them contracted syphilis. Now the main goal for the Spaniards was to find gold in Central America. However, they did not do that. Instead, they found coffee, chocolate, and tobacco. Three very important crops. Fast forward to 1821, where the Central American countries gained their independence, united with Mexico, and they got a lot of help from the church. However, there was one Central American country whose independence did not come so easy: Guatemala. While they were technically independent in the 20th century, it was basically taken over by United Fruit Company plantations. That is, until 1951, when the president Jacobo Arbenz took over. He put in some reforms that would help the Guatemalan people while hurting the U.S. Fruit Company business. The biggest part of this reform was land redistribution. The land would be taken from the United Fruit Company plantations and given to the poor people of the country. Unfortunately for Arbenz, the head of the CIA also happened to be on the board of the United Fruit Company, his name Allen Dulles. So the CIA made a covert action to invade Guatemala, and they did that successfully, deposing President Arbenz and installing a new president, Castillo Armas. See, President Armas was not as generous as President Arbenz. He made reforms that made it illegal for illiterate people to vote or obtain public services. So it's no surprise that Guatemala went into a civil war in 1959. 200,000 people died, 50,000 people disappeared. The war ended in 1996, which means it lasted almost 40 years. And that's not talking about one of the worst things that's ever happened to Guatemala. I'm talking about morally screwed up. 1946 to 1948, doctors from the U.S. did experiments in Tuskegee, Alabama, and Guatemala. But these were not your conventional science experiments. No, no, no. 3,000 people were literally, deliberately infected with diseases such as syphilis and other illnesses. Among the infected included prisoners, the mentally ill, senior citizens, and orphan children. That is screwed up on a human level. And only 700 of these people actually received antibiotics. That's less than a quarter of the people who were tested. Well, that was horrible. Let's see how Guatemala is doing today. There are some pros and cons of Guatemala today. Let's start with the cons, which is poverty, violence, drug trafficking, also violations of human rights, especially among the indigenous people. Good news for Guatemala. They're a developing country with a booming tourism industry, and they got free education for universities. Next, let's talk about the history of El Salvador. In 1932, President Arroyo ordered La Matanza, or the massacre of indigenous people. 30,000 were killed, and it forced the assimilation of indigenous people into El Salvador culture. For example, he banned the practice of native customs and banned the indigenous language, like straight up. So it's no surprise that the indigenous people emigrated elsewhere, especially Honduras. In 1969, the military took over the government, and a lot of Salvadorans emigrated to Honduras. And Honduras started to dislike this emigration. These immigrants were persecuted against, with 4,000 being dead, 300,000 being missing. This led to the football war between El Salvador and Honduras. And it was called the Football War because in the midst of all this crisis, El Salvador national team and Honduras national team were playing against each other in a football tournament. And by football, of course, I mean soccer. I'm not talking about American football. Why would they play American football in Central America? After the football war, in which 5,000 people died, there was a civil war 3 years later that lasted 20 years. So that's 1972 to 1992. There was a huge difference between social classes. The economy was terrible, and priests started to be assassinated during the Civil War. Then in 1989, the U.S. started to intervene. Oh boy, here we go. The U.S. started to put military camps in El Salvador, and they trained people as young as 11 years old. Finally, in 1992, the war was ended democratically with a peace treaty. And now let's look at El Salvador today. They got pretty much the same problems and benefits as Guatemala, except their economy is a lot worse and they don't have free education. Now let's talk about Honduras, the most violent country in the world. 1787, Garifunas from Nigeria started to trade with slaves, and that created a distinct culture in Honduras. Then in 1929, Honduras gets taken over by United Fruit Company and Standard Fruit Company. Of course, in 1969, there's the football war with El Salvador, which I mentioned earlier. Then in 1998, Hurricane Mitch hit Honduras hard, killing a lot of people, and a lot of people also disappeared in the floods. Now Honduras is really poor, they got a terrible economy, they're the most violent country in the world, they're number one in assassinations in the world. Now let's get to Costa Rica, who doesn't have that much of a history. In 1880, coffee was really important to the Costa Rican economy. In 1948, a civil war broke out. But a year later, the president straight up banned their military. That's right, their armed forces were straight up abolished. Now they're a peaceful and prosperous country with great industries and great tourism. Next we got Panama, the link between North and South America. And this was important because South America had a lot of gold. North America wasn't really a gold producer. 1671, Panama City is founded by Henry Morgan. In 1846, the U.S. constructs a railroad in Panama. And in 1881, the French start to try and build a canal. However, the French declare bankruptcy, so now it's the U.S.'s turn. 1904, the U.S. constructs the Panama Canal, and now they have full control over the country's fate. Until 1977, when President Jimmy Carter hands over control of the canal to Panama. So it's all well and nice until 1983, when Manuel Noriega takes over. He is a repressive president, and a lot of drug trafficking happens because of him. So in 1989, the U.S. calls a military coup and invades Panama. Noriega escapes to the Vatican City, but he is captured and sentenced to prison. I think you already know how important the canal is to Panama. It's a major source of Panama's income, and it's the only reason that Panama's a bit more developed than their neighbors to the north. Finally, let's talk about Nicaragua. We're not going to cover Belize because that's not a Spanish country, and their history is relatively short. The indigenous people of Nicaragua are called the Chorotega, and they used Lake Nicaragua as a cemetery, because it contained a bunch of sharks. In 1855, William Walker of Tennessee declares himself president of Nicaragua. However, 2 years later, he is deposed and executed. But this was not the end of American intervention. 1912 to 1933, 2 decades, America was in full control. Then in 1936, Anastasio Somoza Garcia and his family create a dictatorship that lasts over 4 decades. Then in 1979, the Sandinistas, a rebel group named after visionary Augusto Sandino, led a rebellion against the Somoza regime. 50,000 people died, but the Sandinistas were successful in deposing the Somozas. However, Nicaragua is still really poor, and they got a bad infrastructure and economy. So next time you try to make a country in Central America, Be sure not to get into too many wars. Also, watch out for the United States. This has been Harper Cates, and I will see you next time.
Which subject are we gonna teach next?
Spin the wheel to find out. Next time on Project E!